By sunset on the 9th of September, 1513, a Scottish king lay dead in a Northumberland field, his body stripped, his army broken, and 9 earls, 13 barons, and 3 bishops lying dead beside him. In a single afternoon, Scotland lost more noblemen than it would lose in any other battle in its history. The man who led them there had spent 14 years building Scotland into a kingdom that mattered in Europe. He ended that legacy face down in the mud of a hill he didn't even choose to fight on. This is the story of how the largest army Scotland ever raised walked into the worst defeat it ever suffered, and how a queen left behind to mind the house ended up organising the army that destroyed it. James IV took the Scottish throne as a teenager in 1488, and by the early 1500s he'd turned Scotland into a country other European powers had to take seriously. He funded shipbuilding, patronised scholars, and held a court that visiting ambassadors actually wrote home about. He was popular with his own people, which is rarer for a medieval monarch than you'd think, and he had ambitions that reached past Scotland's borders. In 1502, he signed the Treaty of Perpetual Peace with England, a deal meant to end centuries of border raiding for good. The following year, he sealed it by marrying Margaret Tudor, the daughter of England's King Henry VII. On paper, the 2 kingdoms that had spent generations burning each other's villages were now family. But Scotland had an older commitment than its new English in-laws. The old alliance with France dated back to 1295, and it ran on a simple promise: if England attacked France, Scotland would attack England, and France would back Scotland's invasion of its southern neighbour. It was a treaty built for exactly the situation James was about to walk into. Henry VII died in 1509. His son, the 18-year-old Henry VIII, inherited the throne, and inherited none of his father's caution. Within 2 years, Henry had joined the Holy League, a coalition organised by the Pope to push French influence out of Italy. England wasn't just opposing France anymore, it was preparing to invade it. James was now stuck between 2 commitments that couldn't both survive. His brother-in-law wanted war with France. His oldest ally needed Scotland's help against that exact war. He spent months trying to talk Henry out of it, sending envoys, pushing for restraint, hoping the whole thing would cool off before he had to pick a side. It didn't cool off. In June 1513, Henry crossed the Channel with an English army and laid siege to French positions on the continent. France's queen, Anne of Brittany, sent a direct appeal to James, invoking the old alliance and asking Scotland to do its part. French money, French gunners, and a shipment of heavy artillery followed soon after, along with a blunt piece of advice from Paris. Just 3 feet onto English soil would be enough to satisfy the treaty and force Henry to divert troops home. James sent one final envoy to Henry, asking him to stand down from France. Henry refused. The decision had effectively already made itself. The call to arms went out across Scotland in the summer of 1513, and men answered it in numbers nobody in the kingdom had seen before. Highlanders came down from the north, lowland levies, border clansmen, and contingents from French and Swiss military advisers who'd been training Scottish troops in continental pike tactics all converged on Edinburgh. By the time the army marched south in August, estimates of its size ran as high as 30,000 to 40,000 men. By most counts, the largest force a Scottish king had ever put into the field. James had reorganised his infantry around a weapon that had been reshaping European battlefields for decades: the pike. 18 feet of ash and steel, wielded in tight, bristling formations called schiltrons. Used correctly by drilled, disciplined troops, the pike square was close to unstoppable in open, level ground. The problem was that, used correctly, required months of training. Scotland's hastily assembled levies simply hadn't had time for, and open, level ground was a condition nobody could guarantee on a Northumberland hillside in September. James crossed the border at Coldstream on the 22nd of August. In keeping with the chivalric custom of the time, he'd already sent formal notice of his intent to invade a month in advance, which meant the English knew exactly what was coming. The border castles of Norham, Etowle and Wark fell to the Scots, one after another. And then, strangely, the advance slowed to a crawl. James didn't push deep into England. He held position, besieging castles, gathering loot, waiting. Some historians read this as deliberate, a limited incursion designed to satisfy the French alliance and pull Henry's attention home without committing to a full-scale war he didn't actually want. Whatever the reasoning, the delay cost him. Provisions ran short. Disease spread through the camp. Men who'd already collected their share of plunder started slipping away in the night. By early September, an army that had crossed the border at perhaps 40,000 strong had shrunk to somewhere closer to 30,000. Henry VIII was in France when the invasion began, which meant defending the north of England fell to someone else. That someone was Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, a 70-year-old veteran who'd fought at Barnet and Bosworth decades earlier and knew exactly what a Scottish army looked like up close. The complication was that Henry had already stripped southern England of fighting men for his own French campaign, which meant Surrey had to build an entire defensive force out of the northern counties alone, the one part of the country Henry hadn't already drained. And the woman directing that effort from London wasn't Henry. It was his wife. Catherine of Aragon had been left as regent while her husband campaigned abroad, and she took the responsibility seriously. She helped organise supply, reinforcement, and logistics for the army gathering to meet the Scots, and according to several contemporary accounts, she made clear she intended to ride north herself if the situation demanded it. Henry's queen was, in practical terms, running the war effort that would decide whether his northern border held, while he was 300 miles away, besieging a French town. Between Surrey's command and Catherine's organisation, the English assembled a force of roughly 26,000 men. Smaller than the Scottish army, but built differently. Where James had pikes, Surrey had billmen, soldiers carrying the bill, a shorter polearm topped with an axe blade and a hook, purpose-built for close, chaotic infantry combat. Where James had numbers, Surrey had longbowmen and cavalry, two things the Scottish army was notably short on. And where James had a fresh, untested command structure, Surrey had decades of border warfare experience sitting in his own memory. Surrey advanced his army north through early September, and by the 4th he'd reached Alnwick. He sent a formal challenge to James, in keeping with the conventions of the time, proposing a set date and a flat, open field at Millfield where the two armies could meet on equal terms. James refused. He'd already dug his army into Flodden Edge, a commanding ridge with marshland guarding one flank and steep ground guarding the other, and he wasn't interested in giving that up for a fair fight on flat ground. His reply was blunt. It wasn't fitting for an earl to tell a king where to stand. Surrey was now boxed into an impossible choice: attack uphill into a fortified position bristling with artillery, which would have been close to suicidal, or refuse to fight at all and return south in disgrace, with his king's fury waiting for him. He picked a third option. On the 8th of September, Surrey marched his army on a wide loop to the east, crossing the River Till at Twizel Bridge and swinging north of the Scottish position entirely. The manoeuvre had been suggested, by some accounts, with help from a local border figure named John Heron, who knew the ground around the Till better than anyone wearing a uniform that week. The effect was the same, regardless of whose idea it was. Surrey placed his army between James and the road home to Scotland. James watched the English column moving from his vantage point on the ridge, but by the time he fully understood what Surrey was doing, the manoeuvre was nearly complete. His line of retreat across the Tweed was about to be cut off entirely. He had one move left, and he made it on the morning of the 9th, abandoning the strong position at Flodden Edge and marching his entire army a mile north to a lower, rougher ridge called Branxton Hill, repositioning to face the English coming from the wrong direction. It looked like solid ground from a distance. It wasn't. Between the two armies lay a stretch of marshy, broken terrain that would turn out to be the single biggest factor in how the afternoon unfolded. Before the lines closed, it's worth understanding exactly what each side was bringing to this fight, because the outcome had as much to do with steel and timing as it did with numbers. The Scottish pike was a continental weapon, brought in by French advisers and meant to be used the way Swiss and German mercenaries used it on the battlefields of Italy, in dense, disciplined blocks that could shred cavalry and hold ground against almost anything coming straight at them. It was lethal in the hands of troops who drilled with it for years. James's army had been carrying theirs for months. The English bill was older, shorter, and uglier, somewhere between an axe and a spear, with a hooked blade near the tip designed specifically to snag and disable longer weapons. It wasn't elegant. It was built for exactly the kind of close, ugly, disorganized melee that happens when a pike formation loses its shape, and that detail would matter more than almost anything else once the fighting started. The battle began in the early afternoon with an artillery exchange, and it went badly for Scotland almost immediately. James's guns were heavier and, in theory, more powerful than anything Surrey had brought. But they'd been sighted on the slope without accounting for the angle, and most of the Scottish shots flew high and wide, doing little real damage. The English guns were lighter and less impressive on paper, but their crews were faster, better trained, and far more accurate. Round after round found the Scottish line. Within a relatively short stretch of cannon fire, the English had effectively silenced the Scottish artillery and turned their guns directly on James's infantry. Sitting under that bombardment with nowhere to go, James gave the order for his left flank, commanded by Lord Home and the Earl of Huntly, to advance. Their target was the English right, held by Surrey's son Edmund Howard, whose section of the line was the smallest on the field and outnumbered by something close to 2-1. The Scots came downhill in tight, disciplined order, their best armoured men packed into the front ranks to absorb the arrow fire and clear a path for the pikes behind them. It worked. Edmund Howard's line buckled almost immediately under the weight of the charge, and his men began breaking and running. For a few minutes, it looked like the Scottish plan was working exactly as intended. Then Thomas, Lord Dacre, commanding a reserve of border cavalry held back near the rear of the English army, rode his men straight into the chaos. Charging cavalry into a pike formation head-on is rarely a sound tactic. Pikes exist specifically to gut horses. But Dacre's troops caught the Scots, after they'd already spent themselves in close combat, exhausted and disorganized from the fight with Howard's men. The charge stopped the collapse cold. Home and Huntly, satisfied they'd broken their assigned target, pulled their men back toward Branxton Hill, rather than press the advantage. It was a tactically defensible call. It also meant a few thousand of Scotland's most successful troops that afternoon were about to sit out the rest of the battle entirely. With his left flank stalled, James needed momentum somewhere else, and he ordered his centre forward, 3 divisions under the Earls of Crawford, Montrose, and Errol, marching straight at Surrey's own position. This is where the ground started deciding the battle. The slope between the two armies wasn't the firm footing anyone had planned for. It was wet, uneven, and cut through with boggy patches that broke up the pike formations, almost as soon as they started moving. A schiltron only works if every man in it holds his position relative to the men around him. Lose that, even a little, and 18 feet of pike becomes a liability instead of a weapon. Too long to manage in a scramble, too unwieldy to bring to bear against an enemy who's already inside your reach. That enemy was waiting with bills. As the Scottish formation lost cohesion crossing the marsh, English billmen closed the distance and went to work doing exactly what their weapon was designed for, hooking pike shafts and hacking the points off before the Scots could reset their spacing. Once the pikes were neutralized, the fight came down to axes and short swords against 8 feet of hooked English steel, and that was a contest the Scots were not built to win. All 3 commanding earls were killed in the crush. The centre began to come apart. James had been watching his army's momentum build on the left and falter in the centre, and rather than direct the battle from the high ground where he could actually see what was happening, he made a decision that fit his reputation, but not his position. He dismounted, took up a place in the front rank, and led his own reserve division down the slope into the fight personally. It's the kind of choice that reads as either reckless or admirable, depending on which century you're standing in. Medieval kings were expected to lead from the front, and James had built 15 years of popularity partly on being exactly that kind of monarch. But it also meant the one man with the authority to read the whole battlefield and adjust the plan had just buried himself waist-deep in close-quarters fighting, with no view of anything beyond the men directly in front of him. His charge hit hard. Surrey's own division took serious pressure, and for a stretch of the fighting, the outcome genuinely hung in the balance. But James's troops were fighting the same boggy ground and the same billhooks that had broken the centre, and Surrey, watching from elevated terrain at the rear of his own line, exactly where a commander is supposed to be, still had reserves James no longer had any way to call on. The English right, having stabilised after Dacre's cavalry charge, was now free to swing in and reinforce Surrey's own division against James's assault. The Scottish king's force, already absorbing punishment from the front, suddenly found itself being pressed from the side as well. Meanwhile, on the far side of the field, the last fresh troops either army had were just arriving. A Highland division under the Earls of Argyll and Lennox had been held in reserve, waiting for orders that, with James buried in the melee and unable to direct anything, were never going to come. Sir Edward Stanley's English division reached the field late and found those Highlanders standing largely unprotected, without the armour or shields that had kept the rest of the Scottish line alive this long. Stanley's archers went to work, and the Highland reserve was cut down where it stood, never getting the chance to fight the battle it had been kept back for. James's own division, sandwiched now between Surrey's centre and the reinforced flank, had no path left open. The fighting around the king grew close, brutal, and increasingly hopeless. Surrey had given an order before the battle that no prisoners were to be taken, a decision that explains, more than anything else, why Scotland's casualty list that day reads less like a battle report and more like an obituary for an entire generation of its nobility. James IV was killed in the fighting around his own bodyguard, struck by 2 arrows, one to the jaw, along with wounds from bladed weapons to the neck and wrist. His body was found afterward, surrounded by the men who died trying to protect him. In the chaos and noise of the final hour of fighting, his death wasn't immediately noticed by either side. He simply stopped being there, in the middle of a battle that had already, by that point, stopped being winnable. He remains the last reigning monarch from anywhere in the British Isles to die in battle. By the time the fighting ended, somewhere around 10,000 Scots were dead. Estimates from contemporary sources range higher and lower, but that figure sits at the centre of most modern accounts. English losses were a fraction of that, roughly 1,500. Among the Scottish dead were 9 earls, 13 barons, several heirs to noble titles, 3 bishops, and 2 abbots. It's hard to find a single noble family in Scotland that didn't lose someone on that hillside. James's heir, James V, was 17 months old. A kingdom that had spent the previous decade building real influence in European politics was now headed by an infant, with a regency government and factional infighting filling the vacuum James IV had left behind. Scotland standing on the continental stage didn't recover for a generation. Historians have called Flodden the last great medieval-style battle fought on British soil. And in one specific sense, that's literally true. It's remembered as the moment the bill proved itself superior to the pike in this kind of close, broken terrain. A result that wouldn't have surprised anyone if the ground had been flat, and one that might have gone the other way entirely if it had been. Surrey, for his trouble, was rewarded with the title his family had been chasing for a generation, Duke of Norfolk. He'd go on to live into his 80s. James IV, who'd spent 14 years making Scotland matter, was buried not in his own kingdom, but in England, his body never fully accounted for after the church that held it fell into ruin decades later. A single bad manoeuvre, a stretch of bad ground, and one king who refused to watch his own battle from a safe distance. That's the difference between Scotland's strongest army in a generation and its worst single afternoon in history. If you want the next battle that turned on a decision nobody saw coming, subscribe and stick around. Wars of Old has a lot more of these.